много. После такого лирического отступления мы предоставляем слово нашему коллеге из Великобритании, профессору М.Бауэру, ВИЧ-инфекционная саркома.
Okay, what bits am I putting? Thank you very much for inviting me to your beautiful city. About 150 years ago, Kaposi sarcoma was first described by Kaposi. He was living in Vienna at the time. First 100 years. The term Kaposi sarcoma was first used by another dermatologist, Koebner, who described the sarcoma as belonging to Kaposi. And then in the 1960s, the first cases of Kaposi sarcoma were identified in Equatorial Africa in the endemic region. So this was the original description of endemic form. And then in the late 1960s, patients who had had a kidney transplant subsequently developed Kaposi sarcoma, and the first description of allograft-associated Kaposi sarcoma occurred. But everything changed in 1981, of course, with the first descriptions of outbreak of PCP in gay men in New York and Los Angeles. And you'll see this was first published on the 5th of June, and it was only a month later that the first descriptions of Kaposi sarcoma in the same group of homosexual men occurred. But dermatologists are a very special breed of doctors. They don't really bother with scientific evaluations at all. They didn't publish this in a scientific journal. They went straight to the New York Times and published it on the front page of the New York Times. Kaposi sarcoma remains the most common cancer in people living with HIV. And in some parts of Africa in particular, it accounts for between 1/4 and 1/3 of all cancer in those nations, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, and in Uganda. And in the whole world, Kaposi sarcoma is about the 30th most common cancer and the 29th most common cause of death from cancer in the whole world. So it remains, even in the era of antiretroviral therapy, a significant cause of global mortality and morbidity. In Russia, the incidence of Kaposi sarcoma is relatively low compared to many other nations. Okay? That's partly a reflection of the different distribution of the virus that we'll talk about in a minute. But you can see that the incidence of Kaposi sarcoma in Russia is about 1 per million patient years. This is the most recent up-to-date data from GloboCan. So just over 20 years ago, the cause of Kaposi sarcoma was described as a virus, Kaposi sarcoma herpes virus, originally identified by comparing the DNA of Kaposi sarcoma biopsy lesions with adjacent normal skin, and they found in the lesions, but not in the normal skin, some sequences that turned out to be from a herpes virus. And this virus has got 2 names, which is really annoying. So it's either called Kaposi sarcoma herpes virus, or some places it's called human herpes virus 8. And amongst the human herpes viruses, it's a member of the gamma herpes virus family and is most similar to Epstein-Barr virus rather than some of the other human herpes viruses. So you can see, maybe I can work it. It's up here, and the closest human relative virus is Epstein-Barr virus. The evidence that this virus causes the cancer really comes from 4 pieces of good evidence. The first is that in every patient with Kaposi's sarcoma, you can find the virus present in the cancer cells. So whether you have Kaposi's sarcoma because you have HIV, or whether you've had a kidney transplant, or whether you have the form that's found in endemic regions of Africa, or whether you're an old man with Kaposi's sarcoma, a classical form of the disease, whatever form of the disease, the virus is always present in the cancer cells. The second piece of evidence is that you can isolate and grow the virus from people who have Kaposi's sarcoma. So the first cultures of this virus ever were actually made from a pleural effusion in the lungs of a patient with HIV-associated Kaposi's sarcoma, and they isolated the virus from the pleural fluid. The third piece of evidence that Kaposi's sarcoma virus causes Kaposi's sarcoma comes from some work done in London in the pre-antiretroviral era in people living with HIV who didn't have any Kaposi's sarcoma on their skin. But if the virus was detectable in the blood, then within 4 years, 3/4 of those men had developed KS on their skin. So the virus precedes the development of the infection and predicts the development of the disease. And the fourth piece of evidence is that if you look at the global distribution of the virus, it mirrors the global distribution of the disease. So many diseases aren't evenly distributed in the world. You know, malaria, for example, you know, it'd be pretty difficult to catch malaria in St. Petersburg, I imagine, especially in the winter. But so the same thing is true of Kaposi's sarcoma herpes virus. The virus is more common as we get further south towards warmer areas, and the prevalence of the virus in sub-Saharan Africa is extremely high, and it gets lower as you go further north. So how do you acquire this virus? Early in the HIV epidemic, it was assumed that this was a sexually transmitted virus, and the basis of that, in part, was that the more sex partners you had, the more likely you were to have acquired the virus. So it was presumed that it was sexually transmitted. But like Bill Clinton, not everybody knows what sex is. I suppose you don't really get that, but there we go. It's to do with Levinsky, anyway. And if you then look at the prevalence of the virus in Uganda, the first thing that you can see is that 10% of children under the age of 3 have already acquired this virus, and that between the age of 3 and, let's say, 15, when you start having sex, the incidence doubles. Okay? So this does not look, this looks like a horizontal transmission of a virus, but not a sexual transmission of the virus. And then if you look at the body fluids where the virus levels are highest, it's actually highest in saliva. It's much higher in saliva than in semen or vaginal fluids or in blood. So it looks very much like the epidemiology of Epstein-Barr virus. If you mix with lots of children in a nursery at a young age and dribble over each other, you acquire your Epstein-Barr virus as a child, as a baby. And the same is true for human herpes virus 8. But if you don't, you know, if you have a more isolated life, you start acquiring it when you start kissing people. Okay. The genome of the virus has been completely sequenced, of course, you know, that's what molecular virologists do. And it has some very interesting genes that it has acquired during co-evolution with humans. This is not a new virus. This virus has been with people as long as people have been here. And you heard from the last speaker, maybe that's 50,000 years, maybe that's 150,000 years. However long there have been humans, this virus has been living with humans. And during that time, it has stolen lots of human genes and incorporated them into the virus genome. And many of these pirated genes, these genes from humans inserted into the viral genome, are responsible for cancer properties. To change a normal cell into a cancer cell, the cancer cell has to acquire about 10 unique properties. And all of those properties are required to behave as a cancer cell. The virus genome can contribute to all of those 10 properties. It has, from these pirated genes, the human genes inserted into the virus, can cause all of those properties. But like all herpes viruses, this virus has two life cycles. It has a latent life cycle, where it sits quietly in the cell, not making many virus proteins, just surviving, hidden in memory cells. And it has another life cycle, the lytic life cycle, where it produces all of the viral proteins and makes new virus particles. But of course, the cell that it is living in and then where it is in the lytic cycle cannot survive, because the new virus particles then burst through the cell and release lots of new viruses and kills the cell. So lytic virus infection cannot cause cancer because it kills the cell, but it nevertheless can contribute. Okay. So not all of the, as I mentioned, not all of the proteins, including the oncoproteins, of the virus are expressed during all phases of the life cycle. During latent infection, although some of the oncogenic viruses and oncogenic genes are expressed, not enough to transform the cell completely into a cancer cell. Okay? So that's why many, many people who have this virus never develop Kaposi's sarcoma. During the lytic cycle, more of the genes are expressed, probably enough to make a cancer cell, but it can't make a cancer cell because it's going to kill the cell, releasing the new viral particles before the cell can be converted into a cancer. So it needs a combination of lytic and latent infection, as well as some of the inflammatory cytokines, to fully transform a human cell into the cancer cell. Okay, enough about this science nonsense. The risk of Kaposi's sarcoma increases as the CD4 count declines. So that with the emergence of antiretroviral therapy in the mid-1990s, the incidence of Kaposi's sarcoma amongst people living with HIV has been declining. And that decline is directly attributable to antiretrovirals. Antiretrovirals stop you getting Kaposi's sarcoma. The modern management of Kaposi's... I have some pictures of Kaposi's sarcoma, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Here you can see the raised, pigmented lesions on the skin of white man. The lesions do not blanch. So what I mean here is, you put a clear plastic ruler over them and you push down and they don't disappear. Not like some other pigmented lesions on the skin. So they're raised and they don't blanch. And that's very, very classical of the disease. And here the same appearances on black skin, raised plaques of lesions which are pigmented darker than the adjacent normal skin. There are a few important sites of disease that you should look out for as well. About about 1 in 20 patients have involvement of the conjunctiva, like this horrible lesion here, which is very rarely interferes with their sight. It doesn't usually interfere with the sight in any way. And perhaps slightly more, perhaps 1 in 10 patients have lesions within their mouth. Here, these flat lesions cause no symptoms at all, but you can imagine this ulcerated lesion or these gum lesions will interfere with eating and be painful. So the question that I'm always asked, many people send me patients that they have decided they've got Kaposi's sarcoma just on the appearance. Do you really need a biopsy, they say? So the reason that you need a biopsy is it's not even clear to the very, very best doctors. Now, Jürgen, will you tell me which one here is the Kaposi's lesion and which one is the bacillary angiomatosis? He's a very good doctor. He can know himself. Not even certain. Which one are you going? This one? No. 1-0. 0-1. Okay, so now we go to perhaps George can help. You can help out here. Same as the penalty shootout. Okay. This one is Kaposi's, and this one is I think he hit the post. Yeah. Okay. So it's not always easy. Here, I was convinced this patient was sent to me by Professor Gazzard. Professor Gazzard has seen more Kaposi's sarcoma than anybody else almost. And he said, deal with it, Mark. And it wasn't. It turned out to be a hemangioma, secular hemangioma. It's really difficult. It's difficult, yeah? I will. And here, this patient with Kaposi's sarcoma, but here, he's got a marginal, a squamous cell ulcer arising on the background of Kaposi's sarcoma. It's not easy, is it? Okay. So, and what about this one? One of these is a melanoma under the nail, and one of them is Kaposi's sarcoma under the nail. This one is the Kaposi's. I only know because I put the Kaposi's, you see I put the Kaposi's under the Kaposi's, melanoma under melanoma. I wouldn't know otherwise, actually. So I always do a biopsy. I can do a biopsy in about 2 minutes, a punch biopsy, because I get the medical students to time me, see how fast I can manage it. Of course, the local anaesthetic hasn't really worked by that stage, but And the features of Kaposi's sarcoma are these spindle cells, these elongated spindle cells, and it's very easy to make the diagnosis because you stain for the presence of the virus. If the virus is there, it's Kaposi's sarcoma. Nothing clever. The histopathologist will give you a very long Latin word for it, but it's not that clever, really. And the origin of those spindle cells, for a long time, was a matter of a lot of debate. But most of the studies suggest that they derive from lymphatic endothelial cells. So these are the cells that line the lymphatic channels, the lymph glands, lymph vessels, yeah? the channels that line them. And that seems to be the origin of the spindle cells in Kaposi's sarcoma. Okay. So how do you look after Kaposi's sarcoma these days? It all depends on the stage of disease at presentation. It doesn't really matter anymore about the CD4 count. What really matters is the stage of the disease. If the patient has edema, swelling from the Kaposi's sarcoma, if the patient has ulceration, the KS is ulcerated, if they have a lot of disease in their mouth so bad that it stops them eating, or if they have organ involvement in the lungs or the gut, then they have T1 stage disease and they need chemotherapy. But if they have none of those features, then you can just treat the HIV. Okay. So here's some examples here. The tumour, you see this young boy with swelling on his face from the Kaposi's sarcoma, and this woman, actually it is, with a swollen leg from the Kaposi's sarcoma. So the swelling makes it T1, they both need chemotherapy. And here a nasty leg ulceration of Kaposi's sarcoma, and again in the mouth there. And here, the classical appearances of flame hemorrhages here, in pulmonary Kaposi's sarcoma, and this is gastric Kaposi's sarcoma down in endoscope. So all of those patients require chemotherapy, but if you don't have any of those, if you just have skin Kaposi's sarcoma and are not yet established on antiretrovirals, then you can treat with antiretrovirals alone. And as you know, and have heard, and know much better than me, about 8 weeks after starting antiretrovirals, your CD4 count your viral load becomes undetectable, and then your CD4 count starts to rise. And the first rise in the CD4 count is a redistribution of CD4 cells that are, that are mainly in the mucosa when you are untreated, and then they come out into the blood. And then subsequent to that, you get new, naive CD4 cells that can raise a new response against novel antigens. And it's at about that time that you start fighting your Kaposi's sarcoma. They recognize the KSHB and start causing regression of your case. So it can take 2 or 3 months before the antiretrovirals cause regression of the Kaposi's sarcoma. So for some people, if they've got a spot on the end of their nose or in a cosmetically significant place, it's reasonable to treat the lesions while you're waiting for the antiretrovirals to work. And for those patients, I sometimes give a little bit of radiotherapy or inject some chemotherapy into the lesions. But predominantly, you don't need to do anything else apart from give antiretrovirals. And this is just an example of a patient's Kaposi's sarcoma healing with antiretrovirals alone. And the classic thing happens. The first thing, they get no new lesions, the number of new ones stop, and then the lesions go flatter, but the colour takes much longer to disappear from them, and often, for reasons I don't understand, the colour depigments from the centre outwards. Like a polo mint, you probably don't have mints, I don't know. Like from the middle outwards, makes a halo. All other skin lesions, all other skin cancers heal from the edges inwards. This one depigments from the centre outwards. Don't know why. And for 80% of people with early stage Kaposi's sarcoma, no other treatment apart from treating the HIV is necessary. If, however, you have advanced T1 stage disease, then in addition to antiretrovirals, it's necessary to give the patients systemic chemotherapy. And the gold standard systemic chemotherapy used is liposomal version of anthracycline. This is extremely effective and very non-toxic. It's not like the chemotherapy that most patients are familiar with. And, you don't lose your hair, you're not sick, it doesn't even affect your neutrophil count very much. Okay. And here are just some examples of the KS lesion that Jürgen got wrong, healing with antiretrovirals and chemotherapy together. Here we are. And also here's an improvement in the pulmonary Kaposi's sarcoma in a patient treated with chemotherapy as well as antiretrovirals. And sometimes you need to have prolonged treatments and numerous cycles, but as you can see, it really can be pretty effective and cause dramatic improvements in Kaposi's sarcoma. And if we look at the survival of patients diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, some of your patients will consult Dr. Google before they consult you. And they look up on Google, and some of the old data suggests that your average survival after you're diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma is 18 months. This is what it was in the pre-antiretroviral era, of course, but now the survival is over 80% at 15 years, even if you have visceral involvement. So it's very important to reassure your patients, of course. There are two interesting areas of uncertainty, really, still in the management of Kaposi's sarcoma. The first one is whether or not there's a true phenomenon of iris Kaposi's sarcoma. This is when the Kaposi's sarcoma accelerates when you start antiretroviral therapy. This has been mainly described in African cohorts, okay, with progression of the Kaposi's sarcoma during early antiretroviral therapy. Excuse me. And in the cohort in Mozambique, they suggested that the incidence of progression on starting antiretroviral was as high as 12%, and even higher rates were described in one study in Chicago. In Chelsea, in London, we find a much lower rate than that. And part of the reason that I feel that we find a lower rate is that in London, we would treat the patients with advanced KS with chemotherapy as well as antiretrovirals, and that probably accounts for a lower iris rate. But the real problem is that nobody is clear about how to define iris Kaposi's sarcoma, because I have already told you, it will, treating with antiretrovirals may well take 3 months before it causes regression of the KS. Because it's not an effect that the antiretrovirals don't work directly on the Kaposi's sarcoma, they work indirectly through the immune system. So you might not expect the number of Kaposi's sarcoma lesions to fall for 3 months. So you would perhaps expect them still to be increasing until the full effect on the immune system of the antiretrovirals works. So this is a problem. Some people say if you get any new lesions, it must be immune reconstitution KS. But I prefer to say that you have to have clear progression and an undetectable viral load. So you know that the antiretrovirals have worked, but the KS is still progressing. So the definition of iris KS is one of the areas of controversy, which makes it very difficult to really compare the rates of different cohorts. The next area of intrigue for me is that I see more and more patients who are developing Kaposi's sarcoma despite having fully suppressed HIV. Okay? So in the last 19 years, we've... am I going to be able to go backwards? Oh, no, you don't want to see it all again. So boring. Just a recap, okay? Just in case you've forgotten. Yeah, you remember that one? God, a lot of slides, aren't there? Okay, so in the last 19 years, we've had 572 new diagnoses of Kaposi's sarcoma. And of those, 110, 20%, were already on antiretrovirals for at least 3 months when the KS was diagnosed. And 12% of them had undetectable HIV when the KS was diagnosed. And 10% in total, 55 patients, had more than 3 months antiretrovirals, undetectable viral load, and CD4 count above 300. So this is a different spectrum of disease because, of course, for these patients, there is no benefit in the use of antiretrovirals because they're already on antiretrovirals. So they are getting progressive Kaposi's sarcoma despite fully suppressed HIV. And it's not crystal clear to me, but the other aspect of care about these patients is that they do not tend to get any of the other opportunistic infections or opportunistic neoplasms, but only Kaposi's sarcoma. They're very, very healthy otherwise. They're not getting other AIDS-defining illnesses or anything like that. They're just getting Kaposi's sarcoma. Also, the pattern of Kaposi's sarcoma in some, not all, but some of these patients is more similar to the classic form of Kaposi's sarcoma, and they're a little bit older quite often, these patients. So maybe this is Kaposi's sarcoma progressing despite reasonably good immune system, which is the pattern of classical Kaposi's sarcoma. But of course it becomes quite difficult to treat because do you want to give them chemotherapy despite usually relatively minor Kaposi's sarcoma? What is the best optimal therapy for these patients? None of it's clear at all. So there's still some interest in Kaposi's sarcoma outside of the more traditional field. And even more patients I see who were diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma in the 1990s or the 1980s who've had no problem with it since then, who are fully suppressed, aging, a little bit older, and they're getting a few spots of Kaposi's sarcoma back, although their HIV control is very, very good. Okay, so Kaposi's sarcoma herpes virus causes lots of diseases as well as Kaposi's sarcoma. I haven't discussed those with you, but it's responsible for some fascinating forms of lymphoma and so on, and of course multicentric version of Castleman's disease, which really wasn't seen very often until the era of HIV. And the whole disease has been transformed by antiretroviral therapy and is becoming less frequent, but the forms of the disease that we are now seeing are perhaps more difficult to control, with KSC in people whose HIV is fully suppressed, and in this form of iris KS that nobody's quite clear how to handle best. Okay, thank you very much. One minute, if you're speaking Russian, I can then listen to the translation.
Спасибо огромное за великолепный доклад. У меня такой вопрос. Скажите, пожалуйста, по половому признаку вы распределяли своих пациентов? Вы посмотрели более 500 человек, мужчины и женщины. У кого больше? Было ли распределение в вашей работе? Задаю вопрос не зря, потому что очень хорошая сейчас работа выполняется по именно саркоме Капыши. И мы обратили внимание, что в основном саркома Капыши встречается у мужчин, имеющих секс с мужчинами. Было ли у вас такое определение в вашей работе? Спасибо.
Thank you for your question. So, the issue about gender in Kaposi's sarcoma is fascinating. The first thing is, if you look at the number of women and the number of men who carry the virus, particularly in parts of Africa where it's carefully looked at, it's the same. But even in those parts of Africa where the gender distribution of the virus is the same, the distribution of Kaposi's sarcoma is 10 times more common in men than in women. So even though the virus levels are, is equal, the disease is 10 times more common in women than in men. So as with every country, we have a different spectrum of people living with HIV. In London, about 80% of my patients are men who have sex with men, but we also have a very significant cohort of African patients, often from sub-Saharan Africa, from former imperialist colonies of the United Kingdom. Am I allowed to say that? And we do have a number of black African women with Kaposi's sarcoma, but it is less common than in the black African men. So it's still skewed towards men. The illness, even if it's the same amount of HIV, the same amount of Kaposi's sarcoma virus, but for some reason it occurs more frequently in men than in women. So in the 1980s, everybody thought that maybe estrogens protected against Kaposi's sarcoma. There's no data to suggest that is true at all, but everybody thought maybe. I don't know why, I can't tell you why, but it's much more common in every group, every type of Kaposi sarcoma. Even in the kidney transplant Kaposi sarcoma, more common in men. It's another advantage of being a woman.
Mark, great talk. Let me ask you one question. So when you have someone with T1 disease and you give your liposomal chemotherapy, how many cycles do you give before you reevaluate, and then how many, so you know, how much?
So the number of cycles of chemotherapy that you give for almost any disease is based on folklore. Folklore from the therapy of lymphoma 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, in the folklore, they showed that 12 cycles of MOP, actually, it was a horrible treatment, horrible treatment, was no better than 6. That's all they did. Okay? So everybody uses 6. There's no sense in it, but everybody does. It is from folklore. So we use 6.
And how many get away with 6 cycles or need to continue? I mean, so you 20% who get treated.
So the majority of patients, 6 cycles will dampen that, particularly if it is naive, they're naive to antiretrovirals. So you give them 6 cycles of chemotherapy and then the antiretrovirals really take over. It's more difficult, of course, if they're pre-treated.
Пожалуйста, еще вопрос.